All right, I think it's about time here. Let's see. I'm gonna share my screen. All right. Welcome everybody. This is a session on from the Night Science Journalism program at MIT, and we are presenting two people today to talk about chapters they've written for an upcoming book that we have coming out. My name is Joshua Hatch. I'm the Director of Digital Products and Audience at the Chronicle of Higher Education and Chronicle of Philanthropy. I was actually a Night Science Journalism Fellow at MIT in 2018 and have been a long-time member of the board of directors at the Online News Association. Currently, I'm working on a book that we're producing as part of the Night Science Journalism program. It's a book called The Science Editing Handbook. And this book is made up of about a dozen chapters. It'll be coming out soon, both in online and PDF form. And these chapters are going to cover everything from sourcing and using social media, which are two topics you'll hear about from our speakers and the writers of those chapters today, to covering healthcare and climate change, holding science accountable, understanding science statistics, how to use illustrations, how to cover controversial science, and so on. So that book is going to be coming out soon. We've built a website for it. Mostly it'll be online. If you'd like to be notified when this book is available, and I'll put this link in the chat, you can go to bit.ly/KSJ handbook, KSJ HANDBOOK. You can go there and add your name to a list, and when the handbook is ready, we'll send you an email letting you know. So I'm excited about this book. I'm excited about our speakers and our panel today. Please ask questions, put them in the chat. We'll probably answer some as we go, and then we'll also have a Q&A period at the end of the session where we'll answer more of these questions as we go. So, sorry, my screen got covered up here. Let me move this out of the way. All right, so let's get started. So we have two speakers. The first is Melinda Wenner Moyer. She's a contributing editor at Scientific American and a columnist at Slate, and regularly writes for the New York Times. In 2000, she was the recipient of the 2019 Bricker Award for Science Writing and Medicine, and her work has been featured in the Best American Science and Nature Writing 2020. Her writing has also received first place awards in the American Society of Journalists and the Authors Annual Writing Awards, and the Awards for Excellence in Healthcare Reporting. Melinda has also written a chapter for this book, and it will be her topic today, on finding and vetting sources in the handbook that I mentioned earlier. And then we'll hear from Katie Fleeman. Katie is the audience engagement editor at Knowable magazine, where she manages social media, republishing, and analytics. Before joining Knowable, Katie cut her teeth on academic publishing at PLOS, and then dove into the media startup world at ATTN. She would like to extend her utmost gratitude to the social media and engagement editors who shared her thoughts and advice in the chapter she's written and the presentation she'll give today, and as the author of that chapter in this handbook. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Joshua, for organizing this, and thanks to the conference organizers. I have to say, I really wish I could be in Italy right now instead of in my house. I also hope that my children do not interrupt this. I hope I don't turn into the BBC dad, but no promises. So I'm going to share my screen here. Yes, okay, and get started. So I'm going to be talking about finding and vetting sources, and I'm excited to talk about this because I think sourcing really makes or breaks a science story. It's so important. And let's see, there we go. For three key reasons, although there are many reasons why finding good sources matter. But the first one is sources are so important for interpreting and contextualizing the science that you're covering, and sometimes even helping you decide whether or not to cover the science that you might be covering. As an example of that, a few years ago, I had an editor ask me to cover a new study that had come out in a good journal by who I thought were good scientists, and I think they are good scientists, but I reached out to some other outside scientists who were in the field to ask if they would be willing to comment, and they said, we've actually had a lot of conversation about this study. We think it's got some statistical flaws and it really isn't worth covering until these get fixed. And these were flaws that I couldn't see, even having covered science for so long. So I was very grateful. So sources can really literally make or break a story. And they also just help you understand the relevance and implications of findings, whether they're surprising or not surprising, whether they are in line with previous research or not. And they, just help you figure out how to, what the implications are and how to relay those to your audience. And of course, sources are very important for shaping and creating narratives. Sometimes scientists and doctors can make wonderful characters in your stories. I love writing about scientists and having them as sort of my main characters in my pieces. Of course, patients and non-scientists can be very important for creating narratives as well. But as I'm sure narrative is a wonderful way to tell science stories and to keep the audience interested and engaged. And sources determine that. And finally, sources bring humanity to science. I think right now in the United States where I live, there's a lot of distrust in science. And I think the more that we can show that scientists are people, and they are often very good, well-intentioned people trying to do good work, that I think the more we can communicate that through our sources, the more we can win the public's trust in science. So where do I find science sources? There are a number of places to find good sources. If I'm covering a story or if I'm covering a study in a story or a couple of studies, I will almost always go to the paper and look for the study authors. So the first author is usually the author who's done a lot of the legwork in the study, and the last author is usually the senior author, often overseeing the research. And those are both great authors to speak to. Sometimes I speak to both of them, sometimes I speak to one. And I will almost always ask them who else they think I should talk to who was not involved in the study. Of course, a scientist is not necessarily going to suggest a source who disagrees with them. So I sometimes go out of my way to say, could you also recommend a source who might have a different perspective on your work, but who you nevertheless respect? And I often get very good suggestions that way. And I think it's very important to include outside sources who were not involved in the research in every science story. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Another great place are the reference sections of studies. So at least with the studies I cover, I tend to cover life sciences. There's often an introduction section in the study, and I always love it because it provides a history and context to help me understand where the study fits in the field. And often these sections will describe studies that have been published recently in the field, and I will go and look up the references in the back of the study and write down the names of the first and last authors and often contact them too. Science databases are great, like PubMed, I use almost every day. PsycInfo is great for social sciences, Science Direct, the Physics Archive, medRxiv. There are a lot of them, and if you can get your keywords right and really home in on the particular field that you're covering, you can identify authors who publish regularly in those fields and contact them. And usually I find their email addresses pretty easily just by Googling their names. And then public information officers at universities and institutions, hospitals, and PR departments can also be really helpful. So sometimes if I'm covering a topic and I know there's a really good department in that field in a particular university, I will reach out to the public information officer and say, hey, I'm working on a story about X. Could you recommend someone in your department who could talk with me? And they're often very, very willing to help suggest people. So I said I was going to talk a little bit more about the importance of sourcing and also getting outside sources. This is the headline and deck of a story that ran in 2016 in The Independent in the UK. And it's a very breathless headline. Scientists might have discovered a fifth force of nature, changing our whole view of the universe, suggesting the standard model of physics could be wrong. This story, when I read it, I was disappointed to see that it did not look like the writer had contacted anyone and spoken with anyone while covering this. It looked like it came basically from the press release. So there were quotes in this piece, but they were taken from the press release. And of course, press releases are trying to sell journalists on the excitement of a story, and sometimes they oversell it a little bit. So this piece really didn't include a lot of essential context that I think could have easily been included if the writer had just reached out to a couple of people for outside comment. And just to give you a contrasting example of what happens when you do that work, this is a piece on the same study that was written by Natalie Wolchover at Quanta magazine. Full disclosure, my husband is deputy editor there. She did talk to a lot of people, and she found there was a lot more to say about the finding, and even some really interesting history and a backstory that was interesting to tell about the research. So, I mean, this also just goes to show you that talking to people can sometimes steer a piece in an entirely new direction, and a much more interesting direction than you thought just looking at the study. So what are some key things to consider when you're thinking about contacting sources? This first one, I think, is really important right now with the coronavirus going on. Does this source have expertise or training in the particular subject you're covering? So I'm going to give you an example of how this can sometimes go wrong. So I don't know if maybe many of you are familiar with Eric Feigelding. If this is his Twitter profile, and he has been on a lot of US news networks talking about the coronavirus. He's very active on Twitter. You can see he has 253,000 Twitter followers. And from what I understand, before the coronavirus started, he had 2,000. So he's been very vocal in providing commentary and thoughts about infectious disease epidemiology and virology. And if you look at his Twitter profile, it looks as though he has the expertise to be doing that. He's an epidemiologist, health economist. He's at Harvard, affiliated with Harvard. He looks like the kind of person you want to have in your story and you want to talk to. Unfortunately, I mean, he has done some good, and he's gotten a lot of things right. He's also made some mistakes and spread some misinformation over the past few months. And I know a lot of infectious disease epidemiologists have been frustrated with him because he's gotten a very big platform. And the thing is, if you just Google him and you look at his Harvard page, which I will show here, you see that he's actually a nutritional epidemiologist, not an infectious disease epidemiologist. And that's really important. Epidemiology is a huge field, and there are many different kinds of epidemiologists. So this just illustrates how important it is to do a little extra legwork and make sure that the source that you're talking to for a story really does have expertise in the particular subfield that you are covering, not just the field, but if you are covering a specific area of epidemiology or immunology or anything, you want to make sure you're really talking to people who know the work in that field and are and have the education and expertise to talk about it. The next thing, does the source seem well respected? Do they collaborate with others in the field? So you might want to look at their papers and see, do they only collaborate with one or two people? Is it always the same people? Or do they have they built a network of collaborators, which suggests that they're well respected? You can take a look at their CV and see, does it look as though they've been invited to speak at conferences, or does it, have they been asked to edit journals? Of course, with the caveat that, younger researchers who are just starting out might not have a very big CV, and that's okay, but you can get a sense for how well respected scientists are by looking at their CV. If they are controversial researchers, it's also important to try to understand why, and you can ask other sources that. Some researchers are controversial because the status quo is out of date and they're actually right, and nobody wants to believe them, but they're correct. Or it could be that they're not correct and actually everybody else is right. So it's important to try to understand why they're controversial. And then, are there any conflict of interest red flags? And what I mean by that is you want to be really careful that your source doesn't have essentially an axe to grind. So if they are receiving money from or have consulted for companies or advocacy organizations, or they've been on a speakers bureau, that can sometimes be a sign that they are not going to be as unbiased as you would like. You can certainly ask a source this, especially if your source is providing thoughts on a new, a clinical trial of a drug or a medical device. You might want to actually say, well, do you have any kind of relationship, or have you ever received money from this pharmaceutical company or this medical device company, just to understand that they don't have a relationship that could be coloring their perspective. And you can also look at research papers. Some journals, I believe, require that conflicts of interest are disclosed, and some conferences as well. And of course, if your source is developing or selling products, you want to be careful and understand how their financial stake might be affecting their perspective that they're giving you. One other thing I want to touch upon is false balance and false equivalency, which I think is very important and is directly related to good sourcing or bad sourcing. So false balance happens when journalists present an issue as being more balanced between opposing viewpoints than the evidence supports. And it often arises in stories about public controversies that exist within the general public, even though the science on the issues are fairly clear-cut. So they often arise in stories about climate change and vaccine safety. There are certainly legitimate disagreements and controversies within these fields, and scientists, climate scientists might disagree about certain things. I'm talking more about stories that, for instance, might quote two scientists, climate scientists, saying, well, we know human-caused climate change is happening, and then balance that with two scientists who are not in the field who say, actually, I disagree, a radiologist or something saying, I don't think climate science or climate change is real. And the same goes with issues of vaccine safety. This has gotten, I think, a lot better in the last 10 years. It used to be there would be vaccine scientists and doctors talking about the evidence on vaccine safety balanced by two parents who say, I don't think this vaccine is safe. And that's a false balance, because these two sides have different levels of merit and different levels of evidence behind them. So because of that, you really want to be wary. Patient anecdotes are great as long as they are used as anecdotes. You don't want to have patient anecdotes being presented as medical evidence. And I will just give a quick example of what can happen and go wrong when that is done. This was a piece that ran in the Toronto Star in 2015. A Wonder Drug's Dark Side. It was essentially told the stories of a handful of young women who felt that they had been harmed by the Gardasil vaccine. And the problem with this piece, and there's certainly, I've seen science journalists cover controversies over Gardasil in a careful way. This was not that, because it really presented these women's stories, which were heartbreaking, as medical evidence, and there was not enough balance in terms of presenting data and evidence to show what the research really tells us about the safety of Gardasil. So I don't even know if it was so much false balance in this example as no balance, but it was a problematic piece. Okay, my final slide. I want to just touch a bit on the importance of gender balance and racial diversity and balance in your stories. This is really hard to do. I don't think any science journalists are intentionally leaving women and people of color out of their stories, but the fact is that white men are in science stories far more than other people are. And there are lots of reasons for this, but the point is that newsrooms really have to be intentional to overcome it. One way to do this is to track source diversity with spreadsheets or shared databases in the newsroom. Ed Yong, who is a great science writer at The Atlantic. He did this a few years ago for his own stories, and he wanted to know, how frequently do I quote women in my stories? And he was appalled to find that I think he quoted women 22% of the time. And he's now gone out of his way to make that 50-50. But it took intention. And there are resources you can use to find sources who are more diverse. And I've listed some of these here. If you Google them, you can find the websites. There are a lot of them. And one other trick that actually Ed Yong told me the other day, I was working on a story and I really wanted to find a pediatric immunologist who was a woman of color, because I had two other pediatric immunologists in my story who were white men. And he said, just Google pediatric immunologist in quotes and then do a Google image search. And you can actually find, because the pictures of scientists will come up, and then you can basically find diversity that way. So I hadn't thought of that, and it's an interesting approach. But please do check out these resources and try to be intentional about this, because it happens. The imbalance happens unless you really push to correct for it. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I will obviously take questions later. And I will stop sharing my screen and mute myself.
Thank you, Melinda. That was great. Really appreciate that. And I want to just, I said I would put the link to the handbook in the chat, but it looks like what we have is a Q&A, not a chat. So let me just share my screen for a moment, and you can see the URL for the, this again is to put your name on a list, your email address on a list, so that when the handbook is made available to the public, you can be notified, and you will find what chapter about what Melinda just talked about, and greater detail and links and resources. It's really terrific. And of course, the same for Katie, who we're going to turn to next to talk about social media and all the other chapters that we have in this book as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie. I'll just add, please add questions to the Q&A. I think there's just a Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar, and you can ask questions and we'll answer them at the end of this session. So let me stop sharing and turn it over to Katie. Katie, you ready?
Katie, who is figuring out how to unmute herself. Yes. One talking about social media is apparently the one having the most technology issues at the moment. 1 second. And you can now see the wrong screen. Can you see that one?
Yep. If you can probably hit the share screen again to pick a different one if you want, or you can just go with this. It's up to you. Or you know what? Maybe click that swap displays button and that should get you going.
There we go.
Excellent.
Now it should be on the correct one. So hi, I'm Katie. I'm the social media, I'm the audience engagement editor for Knowable magazine. There's my Twitter handle right there. And I did the chapter on sharing social media stories and audience engagement. And one thing that really struck me when I was writing it is that social media and, quote, audience engagement are a bit of a moving target. It sort of feels like every single, what might have been the canonical knowledge 2 or 3 years ago, you wake up one day and Mark Zuckerberg has decided he's going to change Facebook's algorithm. It's going to be something different. And then another thing that struck me is that there are just so many different options out there. There are so many different social media platforms. It seems like there's a new one every single day. So how I went about this was thinking about talking to different peers of mine, seeing a number of different approaches they have, and trying to present as many options as I could, with the idea that people could pick up and choose what works the best for them. A few general themes that came through in my different conversations. The first one is a just general concern over accuracy. And I know that sort of seems a little silly. I think everyone's a journalist. Of course, we're concerned over accuracy. I do think that there is, especially within science and with so much scientific misinformation coming out there from non-science journalists, from websites that basically are peddling pseudoscience, and especially in the case of coronavirus, which has been going on the entire time I was writing and researching this. There really just is a lot of concern over making sure that what is ending up on social media and what is ending up in the hands of potential readers is accurate. And one personal caveat that I typically find is that what necessarily makes a viral post doesn't necessarily make a good science journalism social post. Otherwise, you know, everything would be going viral and it would be Kardashians and cats and things that probably aren't actually that accurate. Another theme to think through is thinking about the platform, thinking about where on social media your users are interacting with your content, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Thinking that there really is no one-size-fits-all approach to social media. There are going to be differences in opinion, although there are the common themes. And then also really thinking that it all starts with the story. What's the best kind of social media is going to come from a good story. It's hard to take a story that was originally uninteresting or frankly that was flawed and make it do well and, you know, have a good social media post with it. So this might be a little bit of a social media one-on-one, but I think it's always worth to mention of thinking exactly what a post actually looks like when you're on a social media platform. So it's really easy when you're thinking of a story that you're thinking in terms of your own website, or you're thinking in terms of even possibly a print product, and you're thinking of encountering, you know, your headline, and you think a reader is going to see everything. But really, when it comes down to it, a reader out there in the ether who's on Facebook, they're scrolling through, they're looking at pictures of their parents, they're looking at pictures of their friends' cats, and what all they're really going to interact with or encounter is going to be maybe a post text, maybe it's not, that image, a headline, and then maybe your deck. It's possible that that's going to get cut off when you're on mobile or something like that. And really, that's it. It's really tough when you think you've put all of this work into a story, and really it is going to end up coming down to just a few of those elements to potentially attract a reader. It's also worth mentioning that I always say that there is the post text or the caption at the top, and I think that's what a lot of times we think about when we're thinking about crafting social media copy, because it thinks, oh, I'm going to write this great tweet, I'm going to write this great Facebook post. It really is worth keeping in mind that that image and that headline are the two elements that are going to follow your post, no matter where it goes. If I'm posting it as the Knowable magazine brand, I get to control what that post at the very top says. If my mom decides she's going to go post it and share it with all of her friends, she could write whatever she wants. And if you're really trying to get accurate information over to your readers before they actually encounter your post, your headline and your images are the two places to do it. So a few things to think about. First, zapping the jargon. I know that as a science journalist, we're working on trying to make the story accessible. You're just zapping the jargon throughout the course of a story. Remember, as you're going down in a feed, you've only got a couple of characters in order to make it. So say in a story, you've got a whole paragraph in order to explain what, you know, that there's a specific species of bear, and you've got the binomial nomenclature, and you're explaining everything. In your social media post, you probably just want to say there's a new species of bear. You want to think about incorporating visuals. Social media is a very visual platform. You want to bring any best practices you've brought for the art direction for your story into the social media post as well. So that extends to making sure that your image is accurate. One example that the social media editor from Science gave me was making sure that if you have like a stock photo, that they're actually pipetting correctly. If you're thinking about if they're in a laboratory setting and it's clearly a model who has their hair down, that's not going to necessarily fly. And then you also want imagery that is beautiful and compelling and eye-catching too. Sometimes if you can have beautiful data visualizations or you can have boring data visualizations. And you do want to think about things that are going to be eye-catching and aesthetically pleasing. The next one I have is showcasing the story accurately. This is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, where it is really important for you to communicate with whoever is crafting the social media for your brand, for your publication, and making sure that the essence of the actual story is coming through. It's really easy to pull out, say, a compelling stat or a compelling quote, but maybe it's not the actual point of the story. You're bringing in the outside commentary and it's the one dissenter. And then you also have to think that whatever is in the story, you have spent so much time working on crafting that language, massaging the language, making sure everything is accurate. Make it easier on yourself and go back to that original story and find the interesting nuggets to pull out. The next section I have it's called the curiosity gap. This is a technique that can, rightfully so, sometimes get a bad rap. You can think of the curiosity gap in its worst form as you'll never guess, scientists injected XYZ into a mouse and you're never going to guess what they found. I'm not asking you to do that. The idea of doing the curiosity gap, and the example I have in here is from Scientific American, is you're trying to think about teasing the content of the story a little bit. You're providing just enough information that someone can get an idea of what the story is going to be about and why they might be interested in it without giving absolutely everything away. And then finally, you're thinking about testing. I can sit here and give you a bunch of different rules. I can sit here and give you a bunch of different best practices, but ultimately some of these specific ones might not work for your audience. It could be that over the course of the next, 12 months, habits are going to change on different social media platforms. And what people thought was very engaging, right now might not be as engaging a little while later. So it really is an ongoing, evolving testing endeavor. This was one table that I put together, specifically thinking around accuracy and trying to provide context within a social media post. As I mentioned earlier, there really is a big concern over making sure that there is adequate accuracy and context within posts. Most people are only going to look at your social media post. They're not going to actually click through to look at your story. I think the industry click-through rates, I don't want to say the wrong number offhand, but it is in the single digits. So if you think that most people are going to see your tweet or your Facebook post, Instagram, whatever it is, all they're going to read is whatever you put there, and you want them to be able to walk away with some sort of accurate understanding of the facts. Worst case scenario, they're not even going to click it, they're just going to share it. And then you've got someone who hasn't even read the story and they're sharing it to other people. So you really just have to keep that integrity throughout the entire social media post. And that's where my theme of a good viral post isn't necessarily a good science journalism post. So a few different hints that came up through my different conversations with people. One, thinking about putting pertinent information at the beginning. It might be the only thing somebody reads. Using a word or two to contextualize the study. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a Twitter account called In Mice, just says In Mice. And what they do is they retweet different science stories where they're actually covering a study that was in mice. And I think that's really important to remember, that if something is really early on, you don't want to say scientists have discovered a cure for cancer when really you've just solved cancer in maybe one specific mouse. thinking about replacing the word scientist or researcher in your posts with a more specific title. So biologist, astrophysicist, physician. I know for me, when I'm going through our stories and posting ours on social media, normally the editor has already asked the writer to pull out what the researcher's specialty is. Sometimes if you want to say, it's really, I mean, I do this too sometimes where you say like experts say this, scientists say that. If you do know that there's a specific subfield, it's important to flag that, which subfield it is. Another option is tagging the source. If they use their Twitter account professionally and it's really clear and they can go to their social media account and you can see, okay, so-and-so is at this institution, here's what they post about. It's another way of flagging to your potential readers what their background is. You can also tag their affiliation. That also comes with the perk that maybe their office, their social media platforms will also see your post and help amplify it for you. Label opinion pieces. If you're, I think that was pretty obvious. With a debate, with those contested fields, if there is a debate, being thoughtful with word choice. And I do think that actually gets back at the earlier conversation about when there are, you know, trying to make sure you're showing the balance correctly and bringing that through even within your social media post. Is a field divided? Is there maybe one outspoken critic? Is there a lot of contention or is it mostly settled? And then if something is completely settled, don't bring in some false balance or misleading hedging. Thinking about framing something as a question. Adding signposts to indicate that there might be more to read. Something that I've been, for us, remember that the signposts are helpful, but they also take up character space. So just being mindful of how much space you're using to tell readers to read more, because it is a little bit implied that they can, but if you really think that they need to know there's more to the story, or that it's an analysis, or or if it's an explanatory piece, that can be helpful. And then also considering threads. Sometimes just the 280 characters isn't going to make it. So think about how you can use the formats that are on these different platforms to tell a story in multiple slides or multiple pieces. One thing to think about if you are the one who is crafting the social media itself is really thinking about the platforms. Now, I will admit that this is graphic is from the US, so these readership numbers might be different for everyone watching here based on what on your own respective countries. But I do think it is important to think about what platform you're on and that the user behavior is going to be different on these different ones based on how they're coming. I think Twitter is the one that's the most popular, especially with journalists, often with scientists. People on Twitter are very info hungry. They're people who, you know, are the ones who want to read the news until 1 a.m. That isn't necessarily going to be the same user behavior or reader behavior that you're going to see on other platforms. One thing that I always try to remember for myself is that Twitter might be the most popular within the info-hungry community, but most people are on Facebook. So really just trying to remember that Twitter is not the only platform out there. This slide is talking about collaboration and workflow. So I think I've said social media at the end of the day really is, in its best iteration, a collaborative effort. You know, by the time I get a story, it's already gone through a reporter, an editor, a copy editor, a fact checker, maybe a couple of different editors. And every single person who has been on that chain before me has a depth of understanding of the story that I might not necessarily have as the last person who gets it. And so I know that I always really rely on talking with our editors. If it's written by a staff writer, talking to our staff writer to try to get a fuller understanding of what the story is and what some of the most salient points are. So for me, when I'm thinking about it, the first step is to ask, and if you're on the other side of this, please answer the dumb questions. Your social media person hasn't done all of the legwork and all of the reporting, there might be things that seem obvious that by the time it gets to us, it might not be anymore. And we really want to make sure that it's accurate. So please, a lot of communication there. Bringing your audience team in early so that they know what's in the pipeline, what's coming up, and can start to think ahead of time. That could be planning for social media. It could be researching keywords for SEO. It could be thinking more holistically if you want to do any other promotion strategies. Setting up collaborative communication channels. A common one is Slack. If you have a Slack channel for workshopping headlines, I think my team, we actually do that mostly over email. It's whatever works for you, which is my next item. Find a workflow that works for you. Test and retest, and then making it very clear that everyone is on the same team. I do think that some of the strategies you think of with social media, with audience engagement, does feel a little bit, it does overlap with marketing a little bit. It is a little bit more about selling your content, about trying to grab attention, which is very different. But just remember that your audience person's main goal is to get people to read your story. And their worst nightmare is to have something inaccurate and somehow inaccurately showcase your story. My final note is that it is really important to find what works for you. We'll probably talk, if there's any more questions about specific platforms, I can get into that more. But I know for me, there are a lot of options out there. It can feel like it's hard enough to keep on top of your existing social media platforms, and then all of a sudden TikTok shows up and you wonder, do I have to become a TikTok wizard all of a sudden? It really is going to come down to knowing what you want to get out of it and putting the effort in there, and also forgiving yourself if you're not on every single platform and doing every single platform perfectly. And I think it's easy to come away with worrying that there's way too many options out there. And I think that this is the collective wisdom of a bunch of people. So find what works for you.
Thanks, Katie. That's great. Really appreciate it and good advice there. Please, folks, ask questions in the Q&A channel. And I'll actually start with one I have for Melinda about sourcing. You talked a bit about diversifying sources and making sure that you're quoting from, sort of representational group of scientists and researchers and sources in your stories. Do you find, or have you found, that some groups tend to be more responsive or even more enthusiastic about putting themselves forward than other groups? And how do you, how does that alter how you approach sources and trying to, ensure that you have representation in your stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I think I said, there are a lot of reasons for the imbalance, and one of them is that I do find when I reach out to men for comments for stories, they are often much more likely to say yes. I think there are probably so many reasons for this. And right now with the pandemic too, I think, women are unfortunately also dealing with more childcare sometimes. So it's hard. And I find sometimes I just have to reach out to like twice as many women as I do men if I want women in the story, because I will get a lot more no's. And sometimes, depending on the reason for the no, I will feel comfortable enough to try to compromise and say, well, would you maybe just have 5 minutes, or would you be willing to just talk? There's a lot of different reasons why I find women say no. Sometimes it's that they don't feel they have the expertise. And sometimes I will push back on that if I think they actually really do and they have an important perspective. But yeah, I do find it's sometimes harder, especially to get women to talk to me. But so I just reach out to more, and I try to get the balance that way.
And do you ever say to them, one of my goals here is to make sure that, my stories represent people, and I'm finding it hard to get women who will speak about this. And does that work, or does that?
I have said that. And I think it has helped. I mean, it's hard to know. I have actually had women appreciate that that was one of my goals, that I was actually reaching out to them in part because I want women in my stories. And so, I don't know how much that will change their mind, but sometimes I am open about that, and I think they kind of appreciate that I'm thinking about it. And that certainly happened with the pediatric immunologist that I spoke with, who I found through Ed Yong's trick of, or actually he found her for me through his trick, and then he explained the trick. And I spoke with her, and she said, "How did you find me?" And I told her, and she said, "Wow, I can't believe you're actually thinking about this and being intentional about it. And I'm so grateful. I'm going to tell all my colleagues that you all are trying to do this." So it was kind of a neat moment.
Good, very good. Katie, and we'll get to the audience questions. Please continue to ask questions in here. A lot of what, and of course your chapter goes much more detail, has much more than what we had time to cover here today. Much of what you were talking about is about, for lack of a better way of putting it, promoting stories on social media. I'm curious if you can just speak very briefly about other ways that social media can be used, whether it's as a storytelling platform itself or in terms of connecting with others, and maybe some thoughts you have on that.
Yeah. So social is a two-way street, or multi-way street, you can even think about it. A few different ways that you can use social media beyond just promoting your own stories. One of them is it could be a way to find sources as well. Please make sure to do the due diligence that Melinda already told you about doing. There are a number of hashtags out there specifically for diversity in STEM. I think I can drop a couple more of the specific ones. There's like Black in STEM, women in STEM, and that's one way that you can go through and use the platforms to try to find who are people already having these conversations that you might be interested in, and finding who some of those voices are. Another way is by interacting with your audience, of course. I think one example that I used was we had a mistake go out in a newsletter one time. And of course, our newsletter goes out before I wake up. So we woke up and there were a bunch of TKs in it. And using, there was like a glitch in the newsletter thing. So in the newsletter tool, so it sent an earlier draft out, like we had sent it perfectly and then it just reverted. So using social media to humanize us a little bit and letting all of our social media followers know, like we see it, we see the TK apocalypse, we know it's there, we're fixing it. Please bear with us. And hey, if you want to, you can sign up for our newsletter and maybe you'll get the mistake in the future sometime too. If there are issues potentially with a story, if people have questions, that's one of those areas where sometimes there's a little bit of a vetting process as to who is actually asking you a genuine question versus who might be a crank or who might have an agenda or an axe to grind. I think there are a lot of people who do ask genuine questions out there, and I'll always flag those to either an editor or to a writer to see if they want to respond. Sometimes it comes from me as the magazine's handle. Sometimes I just say, hey, this person looks like they've got a genuine question. Can you talk with them? And then you can also use social media for storytelling in its own right as well. Depending on your strategy, if you are okay, if your strategy allows for putting content out there that's not on your own site, and I have to do that caveat that you do always want to think, like, if you're putting this content just there on social media, that means you're not bringing people back to your own owned and operated. So if you've decided that Facebook Live works for you and doing live streams on a video is, live streams on Facebook itself is a winning strategy for you. You can, do live streams, you could do Twitter chats, you could do, one example is a Reddit AMA. Reddit has, how do I put this? It's a type of Reddit interaction called an Ask Me Anything, where someone will post like, I'm a science journalist, or maybe you bring in a source and you say, I'm a science journalist and this is my astronomer, and this is an astronomer. We recently had published this story, here's the paper, ask me anything. And that's a way that you can engage with audiences on the platform itself.
Great. So one of the things you just mentioned, Katie, was about people responding to your tweets on Twitter. And Michaela Lundell asks a question: how do you deal with Twitter commenters who write the same whining points irrespective of what you tweet about? And then adds an example, for example, the researcher disappointed because of limited funding. So I think the essential question there is, when do you respond and when don't you respond, and when do you sort of stop bothering, and how do you kind of deal with the world where maybe people don't always recognize that they're actually talking to real people?
There are a few things to think about. The first, I'll look at the question, and if the question is relevant, if you're tweeting, if you've shared a story about, like I said, about astronomy, and they're tweeting at you about their lack of funding for epidemiology, then you kind of can easily see that maybe that's a question you don't want to engage with. Going to their account, seeing if they are someone who's just consistently tweeting at brands or tweeting at publisher handles. If someone is saying the exact same thing at Target that they're saying to you, then it's possible they're just sitting there trying to get some sort of attention. But then on the counter side, if it looks like someone who is really genuinely engaging with your content, even if they are a mostly reply account, but they are answering a legitimate question, maybe you favorite it if it's something, to just kind of give that little acknowledgement of, yes, we see you, we know you're there. Sometimes thinking, is this appropriate for the official publisher handle to respond to, or is this something that maybe I, as the audience engagement editor, should reply? One example was we used to do promoted tweets just with like a general, we were testing out one of Twitter's features that would just boost your tweets a little bit to a couple of additional people, which meant that some tweets that shouldn't have necessarily been promoted were showing up in people's feeds as a promoted one, and someone tweeted at us like, why is this showing up? And then I think I just responded for my personal one, and I just said, oh, hi, I'm the person who does the social media for us. This was part of a test. And I don't think they ever responded. Sometimes I think people just want to feel like someone's listening to them, or that they're being somewhat acknowledged. So it is a little bit of that vetting of deciding whether or not someone is worth the time and the emotional energy to engage with.
It is often interesting how people assume that, for lack of a better word, brands are not managed by people. And once a person actually responds, people tend to calm down rather quickly and almost embarrassed that they're like, oh, a real human actually read this. Oops.
A couple, like really early on at Knowable, I think I posted a tweet with a very small, it's the kind of it wasn't an error, but it was like a pedantic semantic difference in how a framing or a phrasing was. And I think it was a scientist who said something snarky back at me. And then I, kind of just said, oh yeah, clearer way, we should have said it like this. And then he was very apologetic, which is a very reassuring feeling that, when they recognize the person, if they're a good faith actor, then they will be kind to you, hopefully. Good.
Melinda, you had mentioned a number of sources, 500, I think it was 500 women scientists. I'm pausing because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, but I know it's in the chapter and you mentioned it earlier, but a website to find women scientists and other places to find good people to talk to. Not to throw you a curveball here, but are there sites or places that, for lack of a better word, kind of warn you off of, or ways that kind of help you steer clear of folks that maybe you shouldn't be going to? I hope that's not an unfair question to ask. Maybe around predatory journals or other things that, at least help people say, yeah, maybe this is not an expert I should turn to.
Yeah, I haven't found one for sources. That would be amazing. You mentioned predatory journals. There is a website that keeps track of predatory journals. These are journals that are publishing content that is questionable for some reason or another generally. And I can't remember the website. It's something like No More Predatory Journals or something. If you Google that, you could probably find it. And it's an organization that maintains a list of these journals to be wary of. I have never found anything that talks about, you know, scientists to steer clear of. Sometimes if I'm covering something really contentious, I will ask my sources, you know, is there anyone that you think I shouldn't talk to? Or I remember once I was covering research on sexual violence, and one of my sources said, just so you know, please don't talk to so-and-so who studies this issue, but who also has just been accused of sexual harassment himself. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm glad that she told me that. And I wouldn't have thought to ask, but sometimes I do ask, especially if it's a really gnarly field or I'm covering an issue where it's really hard to tell who to trust. I will sometimes ask sources for their opinions. And, you know, I take it with a grain of salt too, that sometimes maybe a source will say, don't talk to so-and-so just because that person disagrees with them for some reason in a legitimate way. So I always have to kind of keep in mind that there could be that going on, but yeah, it can be helpful sometimes to ask that.
Okay. And Katie, there's a question here from Erica Villa, who asks, which is the engagement index and strategy you think is more efficient? And I think maybe what that question is getting at is in part, how do you establish a strategy that works for your newsroom? I'm not asking you to sort of say, hey, here's the strategy you should use, but rather what, you know, very briefly, kind of what's a process to develop a strategy for social media, and then a way to evaluate that strategy's success? I know that's a big question, so you know, you can kind of bring that down a little bit, and I'll of course point people back to the book. Does go into some of that, but take a moment.
Yeah, that's a big question. So the first is identifying what your strategic goals are, and that is a very tough thing to necessarily pin down. It does, frankly, potentially come down to what your business model is for some places. If you are a nonprofit foundation-funded newsroom, what your overall audience goals might be different from someone who has a reader revenue or a subscription-based outlet. And this is more on the marketing business side of what you could say with the engagement strategy. It could be that your newsroom is trying to identify like specific audience goals or engagement or editorial goals. You could say, okay, we're not thinking about the revenue side of this at all. We know that we have a blockbuster report coming out and our goal is to get it in front of as many people as possible. Or you could be saying, we know we've got something very specific to this one region and we want to make sure that as many, you know, we want to reach parent, you know, you've got your target, you want to reach parents in this area because it's relevant to parents or someone in the education system. I think it really, you first have to come up with what those goals are and what you think the outcome will be. And then it comes down to choosing the right metrics. You could say, you know, the page views are great. We all want to get lots and lots of readers on our stories, but sometimes page views are not actually in most cases now, page views are not necessarily the best metric. You could be looking at something like engage time on your site. So you want to say, not only do I want to make sure I'm reaching parents in this particular region, I also want to make sure that we've got maybe, I don't want to throw out a specific number because it's going to depend on what analytics tool you're using and sort of all of these technical things I don't want to necessarily get into, but maybe you have said that time on site is going to be your North Star. Maybe you're going to say that actions later on are going to be your North Star. You want to say, we're going to measure this by how many people shared it. If you're doing a newsletter, you want to say, I don't just care about how many people read it. I want to know how many people take our permalink and share it on social media. I know now I'm just sort of spitballing different potential metrics and ways to think about it.
That's great. That's great. It seems, I think to sort of sum up a little bit of what you're saying, it strikes me that part of it is, understanding who your audience is and where they are. And then, you have some baselines that you want to then improve on. And of course, those are all going to be dependent upon your, organization. But, that's I think, a good approach. And I know a lot of what you talked about in the chapter as well, which actually is a good segue to wrapping this up. I think we're at time here, and I would be remiss if I didn't take one more opportunity to remind people where they can sign up to be notified when the handbook is published. It will be an online book. We'll also have a downloadable PDF. It's coming together really nicely, and I hope to be able to share it very, very soon. So if you want to be notified when it's ready, just please go to this website, bit.ly/KSJ handbook. And you can just enter your name and email address, and we'll email you when the site is up and the book is ready. It's going to be a living document. So when we launch it, it'll be very robust, but we'll be adding a couple of chapters to it over the next few months and continuing to build it out and take feedback. But we really are looking forward to getting it out there. I'm incredibly appreciative to, of course, all the authors of the handbook, but especially to Katie and Melinda for being here today. As Melinda said, I wish we could be in Italy with you. Hopefully soon we can get back to a more normal world again. But thank you, Katie, thank you, Melinda, and thanks everybody in the audience for taking part in today. Ciao.